All right, we're official now. All right, thanks for your patience as we get started there. So how's everybody? You good? Did you survive? We're good. Okay. Everybody's snacking. I'm jealous. That's good. Hope everybody's all right. Stuff. So the stuff we probably need to talk about besides history. Due dates. I think that I went in and changed the due dates for oh crud, you had 4 and 5 due this week? Question 4 and chapter 4 and 5. And I think we moved it, or maybe it was 5 and 6. I don't know. We'll look here in a second. I moved it where just the first one is technically due this week. Now, I do recognize that you may have had some excitement in your life in the last week. And just because you had kind of a week off of school doesn't mean you had a week off. So I understand that. So apparently you weren't like me melting snow so you could flush the toilets. However, you may have been working at HEB and people are yelling at you about eggs and that sort of thing. So you could have had a stressful week. So, I'll try to get caught up, try to turn in at least one thing this week. And then on Tuesday, we'll revisit the when do we want to have due dates discussion, okay? So our due date kind of thing will be a little fluid for the next week or so. The only suggestion I have, I really don't want to postpone your quiz, until after spring break because I think you'll forget stuff. And I don't want you to have to prepare for a quiz during spring break. And yeah, I mean, I know you wouldn't anyway. I don't mean that in a terrible way, but it's spring break. You're supposed to take a break. So the whole idea, right? Okay. Let's look at the weekly question. Let's see if I can find the weekly question. Question. Oh, wrong class. You guys are 1301. You guys don't want the 1302 weekly question, do you? You don't. All right. Poop. Can I say poop? Are you okay with that? There's the notes. You find the weekly question. The notes are weird this time. I don't know how that happened, and I'm sorry about it. I don't know who made those things. Crazy people. Weird notes. All right. Let's look at the weekly question. Deep breath, right? We're good. Okay. So weekly question. Oh yeah. Why'd we win the revolution? Yeah, that's a good weekly question. It needs to be more than we were the best. Okay. A few more details than that. Compare relative advantages of the American and British militaries. How was George Washington able to secure victory over the most powerful nation in the world? Okay. So that's the one that I think was technically due last week, but is due this week, tomorrow, 2/26. Yeah, at midnight. Don't do it at midnight. If it's that late, just go to sleep and do it in the morning. Unless you're a night person, then go ahead and do it. And then the question that might have been due this week, but is probably due next week, how did women react to the language, especially on of freedom and liberty? Be sure to include in your response Abigail Adams' opinions that appear in Voices of Freedom. We'll talk more about question number 1 today. If you're working on the chapter 6 question, I've had a couple of people, well, not very many, like 3, submit some stuff from 5 or 6. And here's some things I would mention to you. Be sure to explain who people are if they're not well known. Like if you're going to talk about Judith Sargent Murray in question number 6, in a little parentheses, say noted colonial educator, or, just put a little explanation in there. You don't have to explain who Abigail Adams or George Washington are. They're fairly famous, so we've got that. If you mention Burgoyne or Howe or somebody, in question number 5, you might say like British commander or colonial commander, so we'll know, whose side they're on. There really weren't too many difficulties with question number 5. Question number 6, people said also, women embrace the challenges of Republican motherhood. It's like, what the heck is that? You got to tell me what Republican motherhood is. You got to tell me, because I don't know that you know. I think you don't know. I'm going to tell you the truth. So make sure you explain phrases that we don't commonly use. Okay, so You talk about embracing Republican motherhood, or you talk about Judith Sargent Murray. Murray explained who those guys are. Question number 5 is a little more straightforward. So, all right, and question number 5 is the one we're going to focus on the most. So there you go. All right. And the book, you know, these questions are designed to be answered by stuff in the book. So stuff in the book, really helpful, I hope. It's the whole idea. All right, let's look at my weird notes. They are kind of weird. I didn't realize they were this weird. I'm going to go back and look at the upcoming notes and see if they're also this weird. But there they are. So my chapter 5 notes are like a list. They're like some of your answers sometimes, but I'm sorry. But here's some stuff that we want to talk about. French and Indian War, the end of the French and Indian War. You know that the end of the French and Indian War is what led to the revolution, because the British people were in a lot of debt because of the French and Indian War. Your book will point out that they were in so much debt that if we translated it to nowadays money, it would have been like 80 Bitcoin. No idea what Bitcoin is worth. It would have been like $10 trillion. I don't think Bitcoin transfers to trillion. So it would have been really expensive. And 10 trillion bucks, that's a bunch. That's more than we're spending on pandemic relief for a long time. It's more than the national debt. So it's a lot of money. So England's got to pay off this debt. And as you know, nobody likes their taxes raised. You know that, right? So, and if you're a politician, you say like, vote for me, I'm going to raise your taxes. Guess what happens? You don't get elected. So these guys who started the French and Indian War, who voted for it, said, you know what? We're going to take over half the world and it's not going to cost you a cent. But we'll spend whatever's necessary. Those two things are not compatible. Like, I'm going to go trade in the Kia Soul for a Lexus and it won't cost me any money. That's just not true. But you know what I could do is get my dad to pay for it, right? Dad would pay. Okay, no, my dad was on Social Security. So dad is not going to pay for the Lexus. Dad can't even afford the Kia Soul. I'm not lying. So England promised to pay for stuff, said they wouldn't raise people's taxes. They got to find some money. So the best thing you can do is spend someone else's money. Like in my example, I could spend my dad's money, except he doesn't have any. So they had to find somebody who had some money that they could spend and wouldn't vote them out of office. And the obvious answer, the American colonists, because they don't get to vote. And if you spend the colonial money, it doesn't make anybody in England mad, really, because here's why. Colonists don't pay that much in taxes compared to folks back in England. I know that may not be what you kind of were taught to think, but percentage of their income, yeah, not even close. And, you know, the theory was they're far away, they don't spend money on the infrastructure, we don't really, protect them, anything like that. But after the French and Indian War, the government said, you know what, we spent all that money to protect you. Now we expanded the empire. We've got to keep troops over there. Somebody's got to pay for it. Logically, it needs to be you. And then the American colonists went, you know what, that's not cool, because one, we fought for this, for your country, for our country during this war, and our lives were the ones in danger, not yours, not people in London who are just, sitting around watching soccer or whatever they're doing. But no, people in the United States who between their American football games were fighting the French and Indian War. There was no American football back then, by the way. Don't tell people, on the football team. Okay, 2, we don't get to vote. So you can't tax us. No taxation without representation. That's what you guys should say as teenagers, right? Like, I don't get to vote, so I shouldn't have to pay taxes when I buy whatever you buy, fast food. That's what kids buy. You go to Chipotle, that's what, yeah. At Chipotle, go like, no, I'm not paying the tax. I don't get to vote. Or when you go to H-E-B and buy, I don't know, soda or whatever they tax, energy drinks. But England said, you know what, you do get representation. You get virtual representation. And then the colonists went, no, we want actual representation. So there's going to be a discussion of that. Now, the American colonists also were frustrated because they were really hoping they would get some new land out of this deal. And then the proclamation of 1763 suggested that they can't go beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where many of them already were, and they weren't going to get to expand their territory. The British justification for that was, we really can't afford to have another war with Native Americans. We really just want to trade with them. And you guys can't protect yourselves. And the American colonists did not agree with those suppositions. They thought they could protect themselves, and they really thought they could probably push the Native Americans off the land. So there's a lot of conflict. At first, the thought is, we can work through this. You know, we will send Benjamin Franklin over, and the Stamp Act Congress will have a discussion with him, and he'll persuade them with his nice Enlightenment ways that taxation without representation is not good, that people have natural rights, that, you know, what you're doing violates principles of the Enlightenment. And that works for a little while, but after a while, the English go like, we're just sick of you lazy guys that don't want to pay your taxes. So they're going to clamp down on it. Okay, so here we go. Before the French and Indian War, there were occasionally some navigation acts. There were a list of things you weren't supposed to trade except for with England, and they tried to enforce these at port cities. But I don't know if you've seen a map of the United States. My guess is you have. There's a pretty big coastline along the East Coast. So if you wanted to stop all of the trade on the East Coast, it would be hard to do. So the English didn't have a big enough navy to do that. They weren't that committed to it anyway. So the people in the colonies were used to just trading however they wanted. So when this salutary neglect, period of salutary neglect ends, and the British start taxing and actually enforcing some of the trade regulations, restrictions can be frustrating. The first big discussion, of course, about taxation without representation. Sorry, somebody left their phone on. It was me. Discusses the idea of virtual versus actual representation. Virtual is what you have right now. I know we just talked about how you don't get to vote, and what a loss that is. But when you're 18, dang, you'll get to vote. If I were you, I would. Really, I would, for a variety of reasons. One, most people in your age group don't, your age group is like 18 to 30 when they put it all together. You guys don't vote. And you know what happens to you because you don't vote? We tax you more. I mean, older people who vote. So single tax rates are higher. If you don't own a house, you have a higher tax rate. So you might want to vote because people pay more attention to you when you vote. So I would vote if I were you. But the thought right now is you don't vote because your parents vote in your best interest. So you have you have virtual representation through your parents. And your parents and you always agree on everything, so they're going to vote in your best interest. They do have your best interest at heart, even though you guys may not agree on everything. For some of you, anything. However, they do want good things to happen for you. But that's not the same as voting yourself. Voting yourself is actual representation. And that's what the colonists said they deserved. What they got was some dude from London who was appointed like, hey, why don't you vote for Virginia? And that guy would go, that's cool. You think Virginia wants new streets in London? And then people go, yeah, Virginia really wants new streets in London. So then Virginia votes for new streets in London. Yeah. So, so sorry. Oops. So the virtual representative could be someone who's never even been to the colony they're representing, has no contact with anybody in the colony they're representing, doesn't care about the colony they're representing. It would be like if they picked me to represent California. It's like, I haven't been, I don't care. I do know some people there, but yeah. And I'd probably be nice, but maybe not. All right, so that's going to be an argument that will be ongoing. And people in England will primarily say that virtual representation is good enough. People in the colonies will disagree. Let's see. Do we want to go right to? No, we don't. We didn't talk about the taxes, did we? What the heck? I skipped the whole first paragraph, didn't I? I didn't. I skipped a little of it. The conflict would lead to, oh yeah. So to protest taxes, some stuff happened in the American colonies. Sometimes the colonists would go a little rogue and go and tear up people's houses. By people, I mean tax collectors and appointed governors. like Thomas Hutchinson. Um, Sometimes, always, 100% of the time, when the British levied a new tax, the Americans would protest the tax. They would either protest it by not paying it, by boycotting it, by tossing some tea in the harbor. You have a whole host of ways that people did that sort of stuff. I know the tea in the harbor sounds like a fraternity prank, but it's like $4 million worth of tea, so it's way more than it wasn't like a couple of tea bags. It was all the tea, all the tea. And England was not happy about that. So, there's a little response to that. So, you had boycotts, you had non-importation committees, which are groups of people that organize boycotts. You had the creation of the Sons of Liberty. You had the creation of the Daughters of Liberty to make homespun cloth and make things in the colonies so you wouldn't have to buy imported goods. So there was organized resistance to the taxes. The first tax was the Sugar Act, and the plan behind the Sugar Act was we'll just tax a few people and raise some money. If wealthy people were the only folks who ate sugar during that time period, now sugar's really cheap. Yeah, so everybody eats sugar. And it's hard, like fruit's more expensive than candy, that sort of thing. But in those days, fruit was probably expensive too, but sugar was really just used by the elite. So the thought was, if we tax sugar, we're just taxing rich people and go like, yeah, we don't care if you tax rich people, you go right ahead. But people said, still, taxation, no representation, not cool. So when they ended the Sugar Act, they thought, we'll try something else. We'll tax everybody a little bit. And since it's kind of a more fair tax and it's a small tax, they won't care at all. That was the Stamp Act. You probably heard they cared. They created the Stamp Act Congress, and they created a committee of correspondence to organize the protests to the Stamp Act. They sent Ben Franklin over to talk to the Parliament. They cared about the Stamp Act. So then, and I assume you know about this stuff from 8th grade. I know it's been a while, but they probably talked about it a lot. The Stamp Act, it wasn't just to mail a letter. The stamps were for any legal document. If you sold stuff, if you got married, if you adopted a kid, if you bought a pure breed dog. They probably didn't do that back then. Do they? You think they did? I don't think so. Excuse me. Goodness. So Stamp Act impacted everybody and kind of upset everybody. So then, still more no taxation without representation. So the British repeal the Stamp Act, and then they say, hey, we're repealing this, but guess what? We can tax you whenever we feel like it, called the Declaratory Act. But then the colonists went, yeah, whatever. And then there's a whole bunch of new taxes after that. The Townsend duties were they called that kind of a grab bag of taxes. So just a little tax on everything. And the one that they didn't repeal was the tea tax. And they brought in soldiers to enforce the taxation, to protect the tax collectors. And that's how you ended up with the Boston Massacre, which might have been slightly exaggerated in the propaganda, but 5 people were killed, which is a bad day. I mean, that's not cool. But these people were probably not protesting. They're probably just a little drunk and throwing snowballs at the soldiers. Now, I think before last week, you thought, oh, a snowball, that's so cute and fluffy. And the first snow we had, remember the cute fluffy snow? That was nice. Last week, did you enjoy that snow? Was that cute and fluffy? Or did that have little chunks of ice in it? Did you guys have any of those giant icicles fall off your house? Dang, I had some giant icicles. I did. It's dangerous. People put stuff in snowballs. I have brothers. I was raised in a place where there was snow. You had brothers, they would put rocks in the snowball. You've been hit with a frozen rock? That's not cool. I know, it's terrible. But they put stuff in the snowballs. It really feels like crap. It's not cool. I'm not saying you should shoot someone who hits you with a snowball. You definitely should not. But a bunch of drunk guys who outnumber you, who are chasing you and throwing stuff at you, you might, if you're a soldier, you might fight back. And that's what happened. I'm not saying it was justified. I would mention to you that their lawyer was John Adams, and he helped them get off. So, and that was with a local jury. So he's either a really good lawyer, or people, put it into some perspective. But it was really good for propaganda, and people started to push for independence. And then you have the Boston Tea Party, which is tossing $4 million worth of tea in Boston Harbor. And then you have the coercive or intolerable acts that followed that. And I think we're in 1773 at this point. I haven't told you dates about stuff, so I'm sorry about that. And 1773 or 74, and there's an organization, Stamp Act, or excuse me, there's committees of correspondence that organize boycotts and support Boston. The thought was that if Boston was harshly punished after this event, then nobody else would rebel the way that they did. Instead, they got sympathy. Sorry. Oh, that word was sympathy from other colonies rather than people going like, hey, I'm not going to do that. Now, if you have extra siblings, extra, I don't mean like you need to get rid of some, but you're not the only child. Like in my family, there were 4 of us, and 3 of us were fairly compliant, 1 of us not so much. Sometimes the ones who are more compliant just kind of look at the one who is less compliant and see what his punishment is. I say his because I have all brothers. And if his punishment is pretty harsh, then they go like, hey, I'll never do that. But then you might have that one sibling, it's like, oh, that wasn't so bad, I'll do that. They won't do that to me. So England thought that people would be so intimidated by the consequences to Boston that they would not rebel and they wouldn't support Boston. But the opposite was true. There was solidarity. So there was like a little rebellion, okay, a big rebellion. Then in the First Continental Congress, and this point we're in 1774, yeah. They allocate money, they make a currency, and they decide to hire George Washington as commander-in-chief of the military. You know what? I think it's Second Continental Congress. I think it is. But that decision's fairly important. They pick George Washington, and John Adams is the one who really makes the recommendation. If you're wondering why does that matter, because Adams and Washington are not really the same politically. Adams is from Massachusetts. He's kind of got that Puritan background. It's the let's get educated. We don't like slavery. We follow lots of rules. We have family farms, that kind of thing. And Washington's from the Chesapeake, from Virginia, where they raise tobacco and have plantations, and there's a lot of rich guys, and there's nobody in the middle class. So, I mean, there is no middle class. So they're different. And then the South is just all plantations. So the thought was, if you get somebody from the middle of the country, that maybe he can unify the northern part of the country and the southern part of the country in the war effort. Plus, people knew who George Washington was, even though he didn't start out super well in his military career and made a couple of mistakes. He certainly gained stature and status as he went along and was seen as a very reasonable and selfless sort of person. So he really is a unifying figure during this era and will be during his presidency as well. Yeah, he does stuff politically that you probably haven't seen in your lifetime. He really wants to serve other people and not follow his own self-interest. He's an interesting, selfless kind of dude. And as commander-in-chief, he stays, in the field with his troops. Like if they have to sleep in tents, he sleeps in tents. British tradition was the field officers would stay in the tents, and then the upper officers would go and stay in somebody's mansion, that sort of thing. So Washington's really good at building solidarity with his troops. And one of the things you'll notice as you look through the chapters, we start fighting before we declare independence. It's probably a sign of where we're headed. So we start with Lexington and Concord. And what's going on there? This is Lexington and Concord it's Virginia. I know I'm supposed to know this, but we don't live in the East Coast, so we just think it's all one state. So Lexington and Concord, this is where there were arsenals that were stored, and the colonial militia wanted to go grab the weapons. And so they ended up fighting with the British, and this is where the British shot some of the Americans in the back, and people said it was cowardly, that kind of thing. Um, and then the first actual battle, also before the Declaration of Independence, is Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill. And so at this point, it's pretty obvious that we're going to fight. But not everybody in the American colonies was in favor of the war for independence. Most historians say it was about a third, and a third. So a third were in favor, a third were neutral, and a third were opposed. Mostly it's people who own plantations in the South that are opposed, and Quakers. And then neutral tend to be businessmen in cities because they probably make money from the English, but they know they can still make money without the English. And then in favor tend to be New Englanders and Virginians for some reason. Virginians, they're a little different, yeah. So, and a lot of that's because those Virginians were those philosophical Enlightenment kind of dudes. So they really liked John Locke and the idea of government by contract, and that government should protect life, liberty, and property, and that if they don't, it's a problem. All right, so Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine's purpose in writing Common Sense, and this is in 1776, was to persuade the average person, the common man, to join or to favor the cause of independence. And this is still before the Declaration of. And Thomas Paine is going to write in colloquial language. You know what I'm saying? Colloquial language, the not language of the common man. It's common sense, common man. And he's not going to use all this flowery philosophical college talk. He's not using his SAT words. I think Thomas Paine had SAT words, probably not. But he's going to make sure that he writes in a way that's relatable to everybody. And he'll talk about how England is the royal brute and an unnatural mother that devours its young, and doesn't make sense for an island to rule a continent, and says that, you know, natural rights support the idea to part. He says all of nature cries 'tis time to part. But it's going to be pretty effective. And if you're wondering, like, why did they need to do that? Because there just aren't enough rich guys to fight a war. And you need the average person to support you, because, you know, you're going to need their help. And there's also not, who knows if you're going to win, especially when you take on the biggest military in the world. One of the things that's unusual about Washington is, even though he had some training and certainly had been around a lot of the British military, he was able to adapt some of their tactics in a more effective way, maybe combine them with things he'd seen from Native Americans. And he'd certainly gotten a chance to look at their weaknesses during the French and Indian War, and certainly had his own weaknesses then as well. But one of the things that was kind of unique about him was, you know, instead of that very European idea that it's not gentlemanly and it's cowardly to retreat, Washington was okay with retreating. If it looked like you're going to lose, and you know, you're going to lose a lot of men, he didn't have a lot of men to spare. He couldn't go hire anymore. So, you know, he had a lot of limited resources. So they didn't have as many weapons, they didn't have as many soldiers. So if he was going to lose either of those things, then the thought was it's better to retreat and fight another day. That's going to be seen as cowardly by the Europeans, but Washington just doesn't care, doesn't matter to him. So his strategy is going to be a little bit different. Also, if you read the Declaration of Independence, and the book talks about this quite a bit, this really is an Enlightenment document. So it talks a lot about nature and nature's God, natural rights, protection of life, liberty, and property, or excuse me, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is how it's worded, but really emphasizes the idea that because England was not fulfilling its duties, and in particular King George, if you read the whole thing, it's not that big. It's mostly like there's a little statement of philosophy. It's like, you know, nature gives everybody's rights. They're not derived from government, they're derived from God. And government has an obligation to fulfill to people. And if it doesn't fulfill its obligation, then the people have the obligation of getting a new government. And then it says, and here are all the things we hate about King George III. And then there's like a 2-page list. You know, in the original version of the list, I forgot to tell my morning class this. Boy, it's good to have me when I'm more awake. In the original version of this, one of the complaints was that he allowed slavery, that George III allowed slavery. And then the South looked at that and said, like, hey, maybe we could take that one out. So they did. But it talked about how mostly, you know, taxation without representation, not protecting the rights of citizens, inhibiting free trade. But in several, you know, lots of different individual specific complaints. And then it says we're out at the end. And then a bunch of people sign it. It's much more eloquent than any of the stuff I just said. But if you remember from Bacon's Rebellion, remember Bacon's Rebellion? All the people who signed that, those were the first people that got executed. So when you sign that, whether it's John Hancock signing it really largely so everybody could see his name and it's like, yeah, come get me first. You signing that when they say they're pledging their lives and their sacred honor, they weren't kidding about their lives. Signing that document meant if you lost, you were the first one to go. You were going to get executed. And certainly it was hard on their families, but signing the Declaration of Independence, the purpose was very philosophical, and also to justify the Declaration. And then they made the Declaration, and it leads to lots of declarations of independence throughout the world. And the book talks about that quite a bit. And I realized that there's nothing perfect about any country, including the United States. And certainly, you know, our founding was flawed and our founding documents were flawed, but the philosophy in those is pretty, I don't know, it's pretty groundbreaking stuff. So, you know, when in your free time, like next time there's a snowpocalypse, make sure you've got a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You could spend a little time reading those and marveling at the brilliance of those documents, even though it does leave certainly some unfulfilled promises, but it also gives you something to aspire to. Yeah, all right. And then advantages and disadvantages of the British and Americans during the war is the purpose of the weekly question. So let's take a minute and talk about that. I'm going to stop for a second, stopping for a second, to see if you guys have any questions. Anybody want to ask anything? Why is Kendall Harvey on fire? Does anybody know the answer to that? Does that look bad? I know, it looks bad. I'm worried.
Can we talk? I'm a little confused by Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill.
Okay.
Like the specifics on that.
All right. Well, truthfully, because it's a survey class, you don't have to know too many specifics about that. That may not be the right answer, or, you know, I don't know. But
Yeah.
what's going on Lexington and Concord, there's 2 arsenals, British arsenals. So the American colonists are trying to go from one to the other to grab all the weapons. And so the British find out about it, and the British intercept them and shoot American colonists in the back while they're stealing their guns. So for propaganda purposes, the Americans are going to talk about how cowardly the British were because they shot him in the back, that sort of thing. But, you know, they were stealing weapons. There was that as well. Yeah. And then Bunker Hill's Virginia? Virginia, yeah. It's just, or it's called Breed's Hill as well. And one of the things you notice if you study the military part of history, which we don't very much in the survey class, is typically there are 2 names for every battle. If you're a Civil War buff, you've noticed that as well. But Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill was the first American battle in the official battle of the American Revolution. And apparently people thought it'd be interesting to see, so they came out with like chairs and picnics and stuff, and it wasn't that great to watch or to participate in either. The British thought that they would just win quickly and it would be so discouraging to the Americans that they would just kind of go. It ends up taking the Americans a few days to lose. And the Americans will lose most of the battles the first couple of years. And that's kind of an issue for them. But this first battle lasts much longer, is much more difficult than the British anticipate. So it's usually seen as a sign that the war is going to be much longer and more difficult than the British understood. So that's probably the general importance of those without too many military details.
Do you know how much, what was the margin of victory for the British?
I don't know, they kept score. Um,
Well, not like
I know, I'm
just an
teasing you.
idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really am teasing you a little. I don't have a great answer to that. I'm gonna look on my phone really quick because I'm not good enough with my computer screen and opening a bunch of stuff. So, um, Bunker Hill, let me look. I remember that the casualties, it seems like, if I remember this correctly, it was a long time ago that I thought about that. It seems like America or the British incurred like, oh, here we go. Okay, casualties. There we go. British, 154 wounded and killed. No, 1,054. Sorry, that zero really matters. And
Yeah.
Americans, 450. Let's see, the battle was a day or two, wasn't super long. British were able to capture the town in Massachusetts. I said Virginia, didn't I? It's Massachusetts.
Oh, Massachusetts.
Yep, so sorry.
No, that's fine.
But the British were able to win the battle, but they lost more people. And I think that was the thing that was the problem for them, is they thought they were just going to go in, and because the British had
Yeah.
more experience,
Mhm.
that they were going to be able to win. That's also where you started to see that strategy where you don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And that sounds like a really vicious strategy, but it's also conservative because they didn't have that many bullets. So they had to save material because they couldn't purchase it or reproduce it as easily as the British could.
Well, I'm thinking logistically, if you're in a war,
Yes. You know you're about to ask stuff I can't answer, but go ahead.
well, with that many people, if you are in a block of people, and
Yes.
you don't want to, basically, you don't want to shoot your own side.
That is true. And
So,
that, yeah, friendly fire was always an issue with that. Let's line up and take turns shooting each other's strategy. Yeah.
yeah, because I would think with so many different, just 1,000 people died, so there must have been a lot of people who,
I think there were a lot of people engaged. I think that you're right about that. And it was probably a pretty small spot. And because of the way their weapons worked, when you fired stuff, there would be smoke and all the stuff and you couldn't see. So sometimes people did get killed accidentally, the same way that still happens from time to time. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but I'm not a very good military historian, so I'll apologize ahead of time for that. But as far as tactics and things like that, I think if you want to read about stuff like that, the best thing that I read, but it was a long time ago, was that 1776 book by David McCullough. Now, that's not about Bunker Hill, but it talks a lot about major battles in 1776 and the leadership of Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and Henry Knox. Yeah, that's who I think it is. And David McCullough is a really good writer as well. So if you like military history and you like colonial stuff, that's probably a good book.
Yeah,
I
I don't
like.
really read in my free time. I'd rather be doing other things, but
I'm shocked by this.
it's still like interesting to me.
Yeah,
It's
well,
just not
good.
the first thing I want to do.
That'll be put it on your old man reading list. When you guys are old and you go like, that
Yes.
history stuff that really matters, just break out the list that I know you'll keep.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's talk about the weekly question before anybody else asks a military history question that I have no clue about. So, this weekly question. I noticed in my weird notes that for some reason at the end of my weird notes, I had a list of things that might help when you answer this question. I don't know what was up with me when I made the weird notes, but here we go. And my weird notes aren't perfect. Let's see. I forgot to put in here who's. Oh, that's some bad typing. It's because I have my roll list on the keyboard. That's what I'm blaming. Or plural. Here's this. There we go. Okay. So the ocean, that's a big advantage for the Americans. And if you're wondering, like, how's that an advantage? Well, you know, it's big. So getting stuff back and forth for England is going to be hard. So, and expensive. So the Americans have the home field advantage. They don't have to travel, plus they know territory better. And they don't, you know, have the expense of transportation. They also don't have a navy, but they're not fighting naval battles, so that's probably okay. It's going to be crucial in your answer to this question to talk about the French joining the conflict. You could talk about the Spanish as well. I wasn't trying to be rude, but typically the French are seen as a more important military ally. So you may want to talk about the French after the Battle of Saratoga joining on the American side. The Battle of Saratoga is the first major victory for the Americans. I think it's 77. And after that is when the French say, like, oh, maybe they could win. And you know, the French and English hate each other because it's their tradition and they were colonial rivals, that sort of thing. So when the French wanted to side, as did the Spanish, with the Americans, but no way they were going to do it if we were going to lose, didn't have a chance. So they had to wait till we won a major battle, and this was it. And they sided with the Americans, and they brought troops and material ships. We didn't have a navy at all. They're going to be incredibly helpful at Yorktown. And the advantage too after Saratoga is that the fight got more consolidated. Part of the British Army had to surrender and was captured, and there were fewer people that we had to fight, and the area was more consolidated once the French joined. It's also harder for the British to get people in and out and stuff in and out. The British have the advantages you think would matter. They have way more money. They have much more military experience. They have a navy, say a stronger navy. They have a navy. We don't really have one. Better weaponry. It's easier for them to produce the weapons. So they have all of the I mean, a lot of the numerical advantage goes to the British. So it's part of the reason people did not think that the US could win this fight. But the Americans have the strength of their cause. I mean, they're defending life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, their family, their actual house, that kind of thing. And the British are trying to keep people from rebelling. And they're probably, you know, they're career military, or they are Hessian troops, you know. What is the word I'm looking for? The I can't think of stuff. I'm really tired, but the word, when you are mercenary, that's the word I'm looking for. So you're not part of the country, you're just fighting because you got paid, that sort of thing. Plus, they're going to get tired of being away from their families, and the war lasts a long time. It's like, we don't even like it over here. Their tea isn't very good. You know, they're going to want to go home. The Europeans are going to engage in fairly traditional fighting. And the Americans are more willing to adapt their traditional fighting. I also want to mention to you, because a lot of times students will write, the Americans just use guerrilla warfare and militia, and the Europeans use the traditional army. Washington was the head of the traditional army for the United States. We had a formal army. So we had a combination of formal army, and Washington thought that was important because it was a symbol of the new country. So they had uniforms and they represented the country in an overt way. So Washington thought that was important. He also thought that militia were important as well. So it's a good combination of regular army plus militia. And that loyalty to Washington's really important, because a lot of times these troops weren't getting paid and they didn't have all the supplies they needed. like shoes. And it was cold where they were fighting. So can you imagine the snowpocalypse without shoes? That's kind of where they were in Valley Forge for a little while. So it's tricky stuff. So that combo of U.S. That the U.S. uses of regular army plus militia, plus the Americans are more willing to wait it out. They're going to hang on and they're going to finish the thing because the cause is more important to them. At a certain point, after several years, the British troops are like, let's just go home. Plus, it's really expensive. War is really expensive. And the British government couldn't afford it much longer. And their thought as well was, you know what, these guys are not going to be able to run their own country anyway. So they're going to come back and ask for help because they're kind of losers. Yeah, they won't be able to do this. Kind of losers. So the book will help you a little bit. Okay, the book will help you a lot. You know that it will. And just make sure in this answer that you say stuff that's true. Don't tell me that the U.S. didn't have a regular military, that they didn't have a formal military. They did, because we already talked about it. Washington was made the commander. He wasn't the commander of the Virginia State Militia. He was the commander of the U.S. Continental Army. Okay, so we had one. Just saying. Might not have been great. Well, it was. It was good enough to defeat the strongest military in the world. We were pretty proud of that when it was over. And then we were really broke. So, because war is expensive. All right. Now, is everybody unified at the end of the war? Not so much. Did they punish some loyalists? Yes, they did. Did they harass the Quakers? Yes, they did. It seems really rude, doesn't it? But Quakers were pacifists. They wouldn't pick sides in the war. So the assumption was you must really be a loyalist in disguise, which was certainly not fair. All right, we will stop there for a moment. And then I know it's not quite time to go, but it's close, isn't it? It's very sad. I know we haven't had class in a long time. You want to leave on time? Even though I started late?
Well, I do want to leave on time because I have to go to a band rehearsal, but
Of course you do. Yep, let's hear it.
what about, what's the Declaratory Act again?
Oh, Declaratory Act.
Declaratory.
That's the one. When they repealed the Stamp Act, so you have Stamp Act and then repeal of the Stamp Act, at the same time, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which declared we may have taken this tax away, but we can tax you whenever we feel like it. And
So that's the Stamp Act they're repealing.
Yes, that is correct. And I may or may not have mentioned this, but when you look at the Declaration of Independence, I know I mentioned part of this, it really is just a list of complaints against King George III overstepping his authority. They didn't want to complain about parliamentary authority because they were asking for representation. So if you were to complain, the authority of Parliament is invalid, then why would you want representation? So they're going to argue that Parliament had valid authority, but they didn't have valid representation within Parliament. And most of the complaints that they'll have will be directly against George III because he wasn't that popular. Yeah, even people in England thought he was a little bit of a tyrant and maybe a little not well. And you could read, I don't know that I'd read that for the US history, but you could. There's a book called The Madness of King George. I think it's a book called The Madness of King George, where it goes through discussions of what might have been wrong with the guy. And it's probably more than just genetic issues, because when royal families intermarry for many, many centuries, there are going to be genetic issues. But porphyria, I think, was a bacterial disorder in your brain that made him less and less capable as he got older. So, and he was probably a little rowdy as a young king anyway. So, rowdy young king. Instead of getting old wise advisors, he got his party buddies, and they probably weren't good advisors. Just, a thought. All right, so before we head out, do you guys have any questions you want to ask? We got like a minute. We don't want to waste any time. I'm still worried about this Kendall person who's on fire. All right, I'm going to tell you who I didn't see in class. Maybe I should stop the recording before we shame people. Should we?